All right. So we're going to get started for Bible study in just a second. Good morning, guys. I know you're having good conversations. Feel free to keep it going out in the hallway or stick around for Bible study, whichever one you want to do. I know we still got a few more people coming on in. It's always a good problem. Conversations. What's that? That's all good. All right, so if you are here and you do not have a Bible with you, you can grab one from the back row, or just make sure you have a Bible handy. We will want everyone, again, that could be electronic, could be on your phone, could be a physical Bible. We have some in the back if you don't have any. Good morning, everyone. Glad you're here. If you do not have a Bible, please go ahead and grab one on the back or on your phone. And I'm going to preemptively do this. Make sure you're sitting near at least some other people. There's going to be some group work, all right? There's going to be some group work. So make sure you're sitting by some other people, groups of, 3-ish. All right. Yes, I know. Look at this. People are getting closer together. You got Barry here. All right. So again, good morning, everyone. We are in week 3 of this series we've been in, 10 questions to ask every time you read the Bible. And so we're on, fittingly, question 3, being that it's week 3. So again, for a recap from the past couple weeks, first question that we asked when we read through any kind of length of section of the Bible, we ask, anybody remember what the first question that we asked is? Thank you, Ruth. Yeah, who is the enemy? And last week we talked about kind of a related question. Second question. What was that, Arlene? Yeah, how is this enemy defeated? So we asked those two questions the past couple weeks. Who is the enemy? How is this enemy defeated? And now we're still dealing with, if you remember, very beginning, the first 4 questions of these kind of 10 question sets. The first 4 deal with just reading that particular text of the Bible. You typically won't need to go anywhere else. You could just look through that section and you could kind of answer those questions in some way, shape, or form. And so when you ask the question, who is the enemy? You kind of only need that text, and then you ask, how is this enemy defeated? You look within that text, and sometimes it answers it. Sometimes it maybe doesn't. But we're sticking in that kind of section where we're just focusing on one particular chapter or one particular set of Bible verses. And so this question deals with that, which we'll get to in just a second. But before we do that, I want to ask you a question. Who is a character from like a book, TV show, movie, any sort of story? What's a character that you're like, oh yeah, I relate to that character? What's one that jumps to your mind when you think about your favorite stories or movies or books? What's a character that you've often thought, yeah, I relate to that person. I understand that character's point of view. Yeah, Barry. Say that again. Mike Lowell. Roll. Ah, yes. So you're thinking the TV show. Yeah. So the Mike Roll, the real person, Mike Roll. Yeah. Cool. Awesome. What about else? Yeah. So I was thinking more like fiction, and you went, yeah, the kind of like reality TV show, which is also acceptable, also cool. All right, what else? What's another character, fiction or nonfiction, that you've been like, yeah, I relate to that point of view. I relate to that character's experience. Yeah, Lynn? Okay, Bilbo. I'm a big Lord of the Rings fan. So what for you draws you to Bilbo? Great. Awesome. What else? What's another character that you thought, I relate to this character? Okay. Yeah. All right. Great. One more. Anybody else have a character they've always felt like a kinship with, they relate to? Yeah, Mary. Say that again? Okay, so from the Bible. Yeah, Job. Yeah. 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 No, and that's a good segue, Mary. I appreciate you sharing that because the third question we're asking, and I ask you this to prime you, the third question to ask when you read the Bible, whose perspective am I taking? You read a section of the Bible, asking yourself the question, whose perspective am I taking? Whose perspective am I focusing on at this given moment? And I appreciate you bringing that up, Mary, because I think you really, you brought up that example of Job, and you started tying into, you've had personal experiences, and so when you read Job's story, there's a level of, I can relate to him at some level. I can understand or empathize with him. Now, why do you think this is an important question to ask when we read the Bible? Whose perspective am I taking? Specifically, the perspective of when you read a section of the Bible, there's all these different perspectives in a given text. And you're asking yourself, whose perspective am I maybe drawn to? Whose perspective am I thinking about right now as I read through the text? Why do you think this is an important question to ask when you read the Bible? Okay. Yeah. Yes. No, I think those are great ways. I think that thing you brought up of it helps it, the reality of it sets in. And I think that's a very important point because sometimes when you read the Bible, like you're kind of mentioning, Kathy, we can easily forget, like, oh, these are real people. This really happened in people's lives. But kind of asking this helps us remember, like, yeah, like these are real people that the things happen to. And so we can begin to relate to them and maybe tie in our own experiences. Great. What else? Yeah, Ken. Yep. One of my favorites, by the way. You can like Jesus Christ Superstar. It's okay. Your pastor approves. Yeah. So here's what I'll say. You didn't ask for it, but this is free. You're getting Pastor Andy's thoughts on Jesus Christ Superstar. The music is phenomenal. I mean, Andrew Lloyd Webber, just phenomenal composer. Yeah, it is not, if you're looking for Orthodox Christian faith, like, what should I base my faith on? Jesus Christ Superstar is not what you should base your faith on as an accurate representation of Scripture. However, I will say this, in my opinion, they do the best job of showing the religious leaders' hatred of Jesus and their feelings toward him. I think that they do the best job of showing what they were like. That he was a threat to their power. He was a threat to them, to him taking away like their basis and their standing. So I think it does a phenomenal job. It does a terrible job of depicting Jesus as his Son of God. They kind of leave off the resurrection on the end and all that kind of stuff. But it's anyways, end of Jesus Christ Superstar. Yeah, no, but I appreciate what you're saying though in terms of Matthew, who was a tax collector. When you kind of understand that, it's like, oh, when you read about him in a story or read even his gospel, that's going to come from a different perspective. And I think what you're highlighting is there's going to be these different angles that people have within a biblical text. And that is, I think, a fundamental reason why we ask this question. And we'll go through some examples, and hopefully it'll illustrate it for you. But when you read through a story, take the two questions we've asked so far. Who is the enemy? How is the enemy defeated? By asking this question, whose perspective am I taking? What you realize is, in any given text, if there's multiple perspectives, if there's multiple people that it's talking about, if there's God's perspective, if there's humans' perspective, if there's someone else's perspective, you then can ask those same questions from those different perspectives, and you may get different answers. It may show something in a more, kind of like a diamond, if you think about that, where you look at it from one way, it looks this way. You twist it and look at it a different way, it may look a little bit different. It's the same diamond, same truth, but you're seeing these different angles to it. And so that's really why asking this question is important, is because you then can understand all of the different ways that God is at work, that God is revealing himself, and also the multiple kind of expressions of faith or non-faith that may be given in a biblical text. And also the other thing I kind of add in there, I think this kind of ties into what you were bringing up, Kathy, I think it helps us build empathy, ultimately, which I think at any point in human history is in short supply. But I think many of us can understand that now it feels like there's even less empathy people have for one another. That ability to say, I may not agree with someone, but I can empathize. I can kind of say, hey, I know in a sense what they're going through, and emotionally I can approach them as another human being. I think asking this question helps us grow in that capacity to have empathy for a variety of people. And I think that asking this question helps us get in that mindset when we read the scriptures. So, with all of that being said, what we're going to do right now is I'm going to help you walk through an example. We're going to do it all together. And then I mentioned the group work. You guys are going to get to do it in like small little huddles. All right? Sound good? Yes? All right. That was enthusiastic-ish. So let's just take the prodigal son. Luke chapter 15. You can turn there or put that on your phone. Which, right off the bat, we call it the prodigal son. Already, we're putting one perspective forward, aren't we? Because if you know the story, there's multiple characters in it, right? But we're automatically making an interpretive decision. This is called the prodigal son. And so already, whose perspective are we kind of elevating from within the story? Yeah, the son. The son's perspective. And we're going to that first. So what I'm going to do, I'll invite you to turn there, Luke chapter 15. I will read there. I will read that together, and then we'll talk through it. Luke 15, starting verse 11. Luke 15, starting verse 11. I'll go ahead and read it. And Jesus said, there was a man who had 2 sons, and the younger of them said to his father, Father, give me the share of the property that is coming to me. And he divided his property between them. Not many days later, the younger son gathered all he had and took a journey into a far country, and there he squandered his property in reckless living. And when he had spent everything, a severe famine arose in the country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself one of the citizens of the country, who sent him into the fields to feed pigs. and he was longing to be fed with the pods that the pigs ate, and no one gave him anything. But when he came to himself, he said, 'How many of my father's hired servants have more than enough bread, but I perish here with hunger? I will arise and go to my father, and I will say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me as one of your hired servants.' And he arose and came to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and felt compassion and ran and embraced him and kissed him. And the son said to the father, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son.' But the father said to his servants, 'Bring quickly the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his hand and shoes on his feet. And bring the fattened calf and kill it. And let us eat and celebrate. For this my son was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.' And they began to celebrate. Now his older son was in the field, and as he came and drew near to the house, he heard music and dancing. And he called one of the servants and asked what these things meant. And he said to him, 'Your brother has come, and your father has killed the fattened calf, because he has received him back safe and sound.' But he was angry and refused to go in. His father came out and entreated him. But he answered his father, 'Look, these many years I have served you, and I have never disobeyed your command. Yet you have never given me a young goat, that I might celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours came, who has devoured your property with prostitutes, you killed the fattened calf for him.' And the father said to him, 'Son, you are always with me. All that is mine is yours. It was fitting to celebrate and be glad, for this your brother was dead and is alive. He was lost and is found.'" Okay, so real quick, how many perspectives do you notice in the story? Okay, so mention 3. So what are some of those perspectives you notice? Okay, so the father, that's one perspective. What's another one? Younger son and older son, fitting. So naturally, there's these 3 perspectives. Now, let me ask this question. When you think about those 3 perspectives, father, older son, younger son, which perspective do you most easily relate to? You may relate to all of them in some way, but what's the one that you are like, I jump to this one first? What's the one you relate to easiest? Okay, so younger son, any particular reason you're drawn to the younger son? Yeah. What's something in his experience that you're like, yes, I always remember that. I pick that out. If I can put you on the spot, Barry. Oh. Okay, yeah. Okay. Yep, so we can relate to, hey, I've been pretty stupid, especially when I was younger. So you read his story, it's like, I get it. I understand that feeling of making not good decisions and having to face some consequences for that. All right. What about someone else from other than the son? Anybody go to not the son? Yeah, Carol. Yeah. 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 Yep. Yeah, so especially as a parent, but you don't necessarily have to be a parent to relate to it, but you mentioned that aspect of there's someone you're close to who's out of your life for whatever reason, and then the joy when they return, and even the pain when they're gone. You kind of see the father's perspective, and you're like, yeah, I relate to that. I get that. I can understand that. What about the older brother? Anybody want to say that? Yeah, I relate to the older brother. Okay, Luke, what draws that to you? Mm. You hear that, Luke's brother, if you're watching. No, so yep. 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 Yeah, no, but you're right. That perspective of whether or not you have a younger sibling, but you think about people in your life who are just like, man, they're doing all these wrong things, and there's that level of like, you want to hold them to account, and that's a good that is a good thing to have of wanting to hold people accountable for their decisions, for their actions, and so that's the thing on the older brother. That you can be like, you know what, I get that. I get that frustration when you got, these people making these, So if you look at all those perspectives, you can see there's multiple angles that you can begin to kind of unpack this one text from. So then let's go through just those first two questions that we've asked, and let's just real quickly think about this for a minute. Let's start with the father. Who is well, actually, let's do younger son. That'll be, I think, a little bit easier since that's the typical perspective we take. What is the enemy for the younger brother, the younger son? What would you say is like, this is the enemy at work? And remember, we kind of talked about the three kind of major categories, sin, death, and the devil. But you can get more specific, like where do you see sin at work? Where do you see the enemy of death at work? Where do you see the enemy of Satan at work? What are some enemies you notice from the younger son in his perspective? Yep. So the worldly things, and that could be kind of his reckless living, kind of that way that goes against the way of his house, which would be kind of grouped under what major heading? Sin, death, and devil. Which one would that fit more under? Sin, yeah, sin. That would be like sin at work. Yeah. What else? What's some other enemies that the younger son faces? Okay. Yeah, so the influence of the wider world, so you can kind of point to that as kind of the way of Satan, so to speak. Yeah. What else? What are some other enemies that are at work in his experience? Yes, yes. When he was in the famine, when he realized, shoot, I don't have anything, what would that be? Sin, death, and the devil. Which one would you say that? Yes. Yeah, that's an element of death, like realizing your mortality. Like, oh my goodness, like I don't have what I need. The enemy of death is at work, so I'm lacking. One other thing with the younger son, his own sin toward his father. His own feelings toward his father. Like that is an enemy at work. So it's not just the sin of the world that lead him to reckless living. It's in his heart how he looks at his father. That's an enemy at work from internally. And then also related to the famine, you could probably say there was nobody caring for him out in the foreign land. Yes, so that's kind of the gut punch to the father for sure. Is the son is saying you're basically as good as dead to me. And when he's out in the famine, nobody's caring for him. Which we as Americans, we read that and we can gloss over that detail. And you may be like, oh yeah, like I knew it was in the story, but we don't jump to that immediately. It was fascinating. There was a study done where people from the Western world and people from like Russia, the Eastern world, they read this text and like, what's the thing that jumps out to you? And nearly all the people from the Eastern world, from like Russia, for instance, is where they kind of looked at. They immediately talked about there was a famine and nobody helped them. Because they have a communal understanding where we have a very individual understanding. We focus on the guy was an idiot, he made dumb decisions. They pick up on he didn't have anybody around him taking care of his needs. Both are true, but again, it's by asking the question, whose perspective am I taking? No, so that's the younger son. What about the father? What are some enemies at work in the father's life? Which there may be overlap, but what are some things in this from the father's perspective? So I will say this: we don't pick up on anger in the father necessarily, but the relationship between him and his son, specifically the younger son, there is a problem in that. There's a sin in that for sure, of just how the son treats him. Yeah. What else for the father? Yeah, so okay. Yeah, so that's kind of a question of why did he give it? Yeah, it's an interesting. Yeah. 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 Good question. Yeah, why is he kind of giving it over? Yeah. Some other enemies that I mentioned. So the younger son disappears. This would be the enemy of death. Hey, this relationship, because he's wondering, like, is my son alive? I don't see him. Is he around? So the enemy of death. One that we may overlook too. So this father is misunderstood by both of his sons. The younger son doesn't understand him because he doesn't, at the beginning of the story, the younger son, he doesn't understand that, man, this is the life. No, let me leave. So he doesn't understand the good life he has with his father. He kind of views him probably as like just this guy who's a killjoy, and he's like, no, I want to go off and I want to be independent. He doesn't understand his father's care. The older brother, he doesn't understand his father either. He misunderstands why his father's doing what he's doing. Why, Ruth, that's the question you ask, like, why in the world did he give the inheritance to him? That's kind of an older brother question. That's like, why are you doing this? Doesn't make sense. So being misunderstood by his sons, that's an enemy at work with the father. What about the older son? What are some enemies at work in his perspective? Okay, there might be some jealousy, yeah, of just that relationship of, man, you're giving this to the screwball. What about me? Like, why don't I get that? Yeah, so that's an enemy. What else? Yeah, Luke. Okay, yeah, there's probably pride in that. Yeah, pride toward his own goodness, and he looks at his brother and he's like, man, he's a terrible person. So there's pride, which leads to how he views his brother, which is probably hatred at this point. But he doesn't even refer to him as his brother. He says, this son of yours. Yeah, Ken. Yeah. Got the lion's share. So as far as inheritance goes, they got the lion's share of it. But there was some for other sons in the family. Yeah, but the lion's share of it went to the oldest. No, you're right. Because that's good. You're connecting the dots culturally, because the inheritance was given to the younger son. He got all of it, and what did he do with it? Squandered it. So now he's getting a fattened calf. Who does that fattened calf belong to? In a sense, the father still, but the older brother's like, no, that's coming to me. And now my father's using it for him. So you can see the level of jealousy, pride, of hatred toward his brother. So you see those feelings of animosity between them. Now, those are enemies at work. How are those enemies conquered? Let's go back to the younger son. How is the enemy of his sin toward his father, his rebellion against his father, how is that overcome? How is that defeated? Yeah, Carol? Okay, so there's a confession on his part, but what happens? Okay, but what happens next? Yeah, shout it out. What do you get? Okay, so his suffering humbles him. How? Okay, but what happens next, though? Yes, so that's really the confession, the repentance, the humbling. That's a key component. But if you confess, if you're humble, but you don't have the next part, it doesn't matter. It's the Father's welcome that truly conquers it, that truly conquers the enemy of his own sin, of wrapping him with his love and welcome, running towards him. What about his reckless living? So he lost everything. How is that conquered? But so he was willing to do that, but what happened actually? He wanted to be a servant. What happened? Yep. He said, no, you're not a servant. You're my son. So you get the ring of inheritance. You get the robe marking you as my family. You aren't a servant. You are my son. Everything is taken care of. So he went from having absolutely nothing And then the father's generosity gives him absolutely everything. So his insecurity and lack is conquered by the father's provision of what he needs even more than he was even wanting. Because Eileen, you mentioned he wanted to just be a servant. He would have been fine with that. But the father's like, no, you're not a servant. You're my son. Which on the pecking order, which has more priority, which has higher status? Son, yeah. All right. So let's think about the father. Now this one is, again, a little bit harder to see, but how is the younger son's hatred, which is that barrier, how is that overcome? How is that enemy of his younger son's hatred toward him, how is that ultimately conquered? Yes, it is his forgiveness. It is that gracious response that conquers that hatred. All right? What about the older son who excludes himself? That's an enemy at work. He doesn't want to be a part of the father's family. He's pushing himself away from the party. How is that enemy conquered? What does the father do in that scenario? Yep. He goes out even to the older son, and he invites him back in. Yep. Wants him to know he's invited, and wants him to know his status in the family too. John, were you going to say something? Yep. So he reaches out, and so you see the father figure is showing this radical generosity and forgiveness to both the reckless person and also to the self-righteous person, showing it to both of them. Now, what about the older son? How are the enemies of his hatred toward his brother overcome? What's that? So this is kind of the nature of Jesus' story. We don't totally see the enemy overcome, but we see hints of it's the same thing that conquers it for the younger son. It's the father's love. And the father is showing him, this is how to treat your brother. This is how I'm treating him. And he sinned against me. And so I'm treating him this way, and you're invited to, so it's kind of implicit in the story, is that enemy is overcome by seeing the father's gracious love. And likewise, the older son's misunderstanding of his father, that enemy, is overcome by the father going out and entreating him. Now, you're piecing all these things together, and you can see these things, and as you begin to unpack, like, who's the enemy at work? And how is this enemy defeated? Who is the perspective that is like, as you look at all these scenarios, who's the one that's looking, in a sense, the one who is most righteous, the one who is doing the thing that is good? Who's the perspective that does that? Yeah, the father. You're kind of seeing over and over again. In this story, the father's perspective is being shown as over-the-top gracious and reaching out to both sons and trying to bring them in. And that's where you begin to make the connection of like, okay, so Jesus is telling a parable. Who is this representing? Who is Jesus wanting us to understand this father in the story to be? Yeah, in a sense, he wants you to make the connection of like, this is God. This is how our God works. And we can begin to see ourselves. We can still relate to it. But I think there's a level of where we kind of look at the father and we're like, man, he's acting kind of crazy. But that's kind of the point, is to show this is the crazy love that this father has. So now, that was real quick, and I want to make sure I give you at least a few minutes to go through one. But you see how, by looking at different perspectives, you can see slightly different enemies at work. Here's what I want you to do. Groups of like 3 or so. So I know some of you are grouped up together. Break it up into about 3. And here's what I want you to do. With the time we have remaining, turn to 1 Samuel chapter 17. It's a lot of Bible, but I believe in you guys. I know you guys are good readers. Read it together, all right? So if you have to appoint somebody to read it, do that. But make sure you read it aloud. So if you have to kind of like separate a little bit so you can hear each other, do that. But read it aloud. 1 Samuel chapter 17, 1 through 49. The story of David versus Goliath. So again, familiar story for many of us. So go ahead, and what I want you to do is read through the story and then begin to ask yourselves, what are the different perspectives? And who are the enemies at work, and how are those enemies defeated from those different perspectives. Make sense? All right. Go ahead, break up into like groups of like 3-ish. Read it together. And we'll reconvene in about like 7 to 10 minutes. All right? You guys are all doing great. Just remember, what are the main perspectives you notice? Who are their enemies? How are they defeated? You can keep it surface level if you want to, but it just gets you through the exercise. What are the main perspectives? Who are those perspectives' enemies? How are they defeated? We'll go one more minute. That's okay if you don't go through everything. You don't have to have every answer. Just want to get you thinking. One more minute. All right. I'm going to call you back in, draw your attention up here. I know there's probably more you guys could still discuss, but at the very least, you at least hopefully were able to distinguish one perspective as you read it. And I know it's a long biblical text, kind of method to the madness too, getting you reading the Bible in a longer chunk, work that muscle a little bit. What are some of the perspectives, the main perspectives you noticed? You can shout it out. What's one of them? Okay, so David is a perspective. Great. What's another one? Saul. Okay. Anything else? Yeah, so like brothers or Israelites. Yeah, you can kind of group those together. All right, let's go ahead and we'll start now. I may add another perspective in a minute. So David, think about his perspective. Who's the enemy for David? All right, so Goliath. Why is Goliath the enemy to David? Could be death, but notice David's response. David, what is his issue with Goliath? But which also, what was he doing? What? Yes, defying God. So in that sense, sin, death, and the devil, which one would you be like, you know what, I think this is kind of an enemy for David in this sense. Which one would Goliath be? Yeah, Satan. Satan, defying God. And how is that enemy defeated? How is the enemy of Goliath as representing evil, Satan, defeated in this story? By who? Who does it? David does. David shows up and he kills him. David's presence is ultimately what kills him. And if you remember back from a couple weeks ago, what's the thing that drives out Satan? What's the thing that defeats the enemy of Satan? Yep, God's presence. David, in that sense, is this representation of God's presence bringing judgment upon Satan. All right, so that's David. What about Saul / Israelites / brothers? Who's the enemy for them? Yeah, so you're saying death. How is death showing itself? Afraid of who's like the enemy in the story? Philistines and Goliath. So notice the enemy in the story, Goliath and the Philistines, are the same for both David and Saul, and yet they represent a slightly different ultimate enemy, because the enemy with Saul is like, they're going to kill me. The enemy isn't necessarily they're attacking God. I'm going to die. And so you notice the enemy is slightly different from both of those two perspectives, even though it's still Goliath and the armies of the Philistines. How is it defeated from Saul and the Israelites' perspective? How is that enemy defeated? Okay, so David has to step in. So do Saul and the Israelites, what do they do? What do they do? To have this enemy defeated, what do they do? They shake in their boots, that's what they do. They do nothing. They watch as a champion steps forward and defeats them. So they don't defeat the enemy. David, representing God, steps in, defeats the enemy. Now there's a perspective that none of you mentioned at the moment. There's one other perspective that you can talk about. Who is it? Goliath's perspective, yes. And if you've read the book, you already know this. But Goliath's perspective, that's a perspective you can take. You could take that perspective. Who's Goliath's enemy in this? God, God's people, David. How is that enemy defeated? Who said it? Who? No. Who? How? So Goliath, his enemy is God's people. Yes, it's not defeated. So that's important. You can take this perspective. It's like the enemy of God, they're never going to win. You see that the enemy of God is going to try and attack God's people. And in this story, you're like, no, they're not going to win. They're going to try and attack God's champion. They can't beat him. They're going to try and attack God's people. God's champion is going to shelter them and protect them. Now, I'm mentioning all of this, and if you are familiar with the rest of the biblical story, you're seeing already connection points you can begin to make. But you see all these different perspectives show you a different element of there's an enemy at work. For David, the enemy of Satan. For Saul and the Israelites, the enemy of death. For Goliath, the enemy is God and his people, and he's never going to win. Those enemies are never going to be defeated. All right? So we're going to wrap it up there, but hopefully that process of reading it and asking yourself, what are their perspectives at play? How do you begin to see from their elements? It highlights various aspects of the same story. All right? Let me pray for you, and then we'll end up for today. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for this time together in your word. Help us to see and grow and be curious as we read your word, to ask questions, to dig deeper that will lead us to know you more and more, and help us to bring that truth of your love and your gospel into our lives more and more each day. We ask all of this in the name of Jesus, who is our champion, who has defeated all of our enemies by his life, death, and resurrection. May we trust in him, and we ask these prayers in his name. Amen. Amen. All right. Thank you, guys. I'll see some of you guys at service in a little bit. The rest of you guys have a good rest of your week.
Yeah, that's all. But